So welcome back, Christina. Here we are for the fourth of our 5 sessions of office hours that we've been doing through the course. And what are we being asked about today?
Great. So as usual, the first 2 questions are conceptual. And the first one is whether the median voter is conceptually equivalent to the average American.
So that's a good question to ask, because the median income is not the average income. Median income is always below the average income, because very wealthy people drag up the average. Is the median voter the typical voter? Maybe and maybe not. All the concept of median tells you is that there are as many below that person as above that person. And as actually we will talk about in the upcoming lecture, the typical Trump voter in terms of attitudes is not what many people believe when they think about income. So it may well not be the case that the average attitude is the same as the median attitude.
Great, thank you. And the second question is whether you can please again explain securitization and how it leads to moral hazard.
Okay, so the idea of securitization is that when in the mortgage market is that instead of, as in the old days, when a bank gave you a mortgage, they would expect to hold that mortgage for the duration of the loan, typically a 30-year mortgage. That would give them the incentive to do the due diligence to make sure you could afford to hold the loan and repay it, because they had, as economists like to say, skin in the game. If you didn't pay it, they would have to deal with the foreclosure, with the prosecution, with owning the house, and so on. So that gave them the incentive to make sure that you could actually repay the loan. If the bank knows that the day after they give you the loan, they're going to sell that mortgage to somebody else who's going to sell it to somebody else and divide it up and turn it into a tradable security, that incentive goes away, because they no longer have to worry about whether you can pay it. They also don't have to worry about whether the house supports the value of the mortgage. So as I think I mentioned in the lecture, you have these appraisal companies that are supposed to give an appraisal of the market value of the property, and usually, the mortgage won't be written unless there's some percentage of the appraised value supporting it. And again, there, if you're going to sell off the loan the next day, you don't really care whether the appraisal supports the loan. So again, if you think about, the bank is now making its money simply on the transaction. They don't have any reason to make sure that the appraisal supports the loan any more than they do to ensure that your income supports the loan. And so if appraisal companies got to know that if they didn't give the appraisal to support the loan that the bank and the borrower were looking for, they would stop using that company. The appraisal company, again, has bad incentives, and that's what we call a moral hazard, to give a valuation that's going to cause the bank to keep coming back to them for more appraisals, rather than to give an accurate valuation. So those are the moral hazards that got generated once we were securitizing these mortgages on a large scale.
Right, thank you. So the next questions are on a couple of topics that we discussed in the past lectures. So the first one is, when we assess the dynamics of negotiated settlements, it seems that civil society is playing sort of a complex role there, because oftentimes civil society plays a driving force in leading up to a revolution, but also it can be sort of a stabilizing force after a settlement has been negotiated. So how do we make sense of these maybe tensions here? And how do we think about civil society's role in negotiated settlements before and after?
I think there are not bright line answers here, because I think tensions is exactly the right word, because I think civil society plays important roles, but it can't act on its own. And the reason is that a democratic political order is a public good. It's got to be provided for everybody if it's provided for anybody, and the consumption of it is non-rivalness. So it meets the technical criteria for a public good. And public goods are very difficult to deliver democratically. And that's why we've had this decades-long debate in political science over whether democratization comes about by pressure from below or by elite pacts done from above. And the truth is it's both. And the reason it's both is because the public goods quality of a democratic political order means that at certain decisive moments it has to be provided from above. There's sometimes the elites have to make an agreement and impose it. And we saw that in South Africa, that after the multi-party talks had collapsed several times, eventually there was a deal between the ANC and the National Party government, made principally in secret. And then it was announced in the Record of Understanding, and other players were told to get on board. So it was very much imposed from above. At the same time, civil society is important in two respects. One is in pushing the elites to make the deal, as in that particular instance, after the assassination of Chris Hani, the civil society eruptions were so profound and the violence escalated so much that the only way the ANC could quell the violence was to promise that the election would be held within 12 months, and the government had to agree to that. The then National Party government had to agree to that. And that became non-negotiable, so much so that later on, when Inkatha wanted to get into the elections and wanted the date to be shifted back, they knew they had to refuse. So their civil society, it prompted the actors and it created a constraint. So that's one respect in which civil society is really important. But the other respect in which civil society is important is in legitimating the new order. So if you think about a deeply divided polity, trying to create a new order, there's no constituency in civil society for the new order. And that means a lot of work has to be done to build support among the population for the idea of the new order that's going to be created. And we saw this in the lectures contrasting the Middle East in 1995-96 to the Middle East in 2000. In 1995-96, before the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, a lot of work had been done to build civil society support for the two-state solution that they had been working on at Oslo for years, starting in the early 1990s. And huge numbers of meetings had occurred with various civil society groups. And by the time 95-96 rolled around, when they were very close to an agreement, if you look at the polling from the 6 months before the assassination, it's huge support for the deal that was emerging until Rabin was assassinated. In 2000, when Bill Clinton was trying to renegotiate the same deal, essentially the same deal, and Arafat and Barak were then the principals. The civil society support had long since collapsed because of the escalation of violence, corruption in the Palestinian Authority on the Palestinian side, the growing militancy of the settler movement, the increased number of settlements. And so there was no civil society support by then for what was basically the same deal. So the elites couldn't impose it. And, the Wall Street Journal and The Economist was saying, what's wrong with the Palestinians? They never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. They were ready to do this 5 years ago. Arafat wouldn't have lasted a week in Palestinian politics. if he had made that deal in 2000, even though he would have been able to make it in 1996. So that's the second sense in which civil society is really important.
Right, thank you. So I know we talked in detail about the US involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya. And a student was wondering how this involvement is different or comparable to what the US was doing in Vietnam during the Vietnam War, and what lessons were learned from Vietnam and what mistakes were again committed in these in these conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya.
So the principal lesson that was not learned was the lesson that Kennan warned successive American administrations about in the run-up to the Vietnam War, which was that you are fighting a war of choice against an enemy for whom this is a war of existential survival. And some believed it was in some ultimate sense existential for the US. They had their domino theory and so forth. But that was debatable and speculative and turned out not to be accurate. And so the bottom line is if you're fighting a war of choice against an adversary for whom it's a war of survival, especially if the costs of the war are significant, you're not talking about thumping Grenada or something like that, in an afternoon. You're talking about a real war against a population that has got everything at stake, and you have to sustain domestic support for that war. You're at a massive strategic disadvantage because they will fight a war of attrition, and eventually the support on your side will dissipate, as it happened in Vietnam. And this is a much older story than Vietnam, by the way. This was the story of the Southern strategy in the Civil War in the U.S. So the North had more troops, it had more wealth. If you imagine the war going on indefinitely, you would have said it was inevitable the North was going to win. However, in the summer of 1864, Northern support for the war was completely collapsing, and the widespread prediction was that Lincoln was going to lose his re-election bid, and that somebody would come in and negotiate a settlement with the South. And Lincoln was saved by Sherman and Sheridan streaking through the South and winning some decisive battles before the election in November of 1864. Otherwise, that would have been the likely outcome. And so again, it was for the American South. It was they saw it as a war of survival, and so a war of attrition made sense. This was the same mistake we made in Vietnam, and we didn't learn it. We didn't learn that lesson because we tried to achieve regime change in Afghanistan. It was clear by 2002 that, and commanders on the ground were saying by 2002 that we were going to have to make a deal with the Taliban because we were not going to be able to sustain. Here we are on the verge of that almost 18 years later. Again, in Libya, the stakes for them are so much higher than the stakes for us that once it becomes expensive and unpopular, it's going to be very difficult to fight wars of that sort.
Right. Thank you. So I know we talked about the Bush Doctrine, and one of the students asked why it has persisted in some form or the other until today, and why successors of Bush have really been unable to end these conflicts that were caused by this war against terrorists, the war against global terror. Why is it that it's still sticking around?
So the short answer to that is in politics, you can't beat something with nothing. And the reason I wrote my containment book in 2007 was that it was a critique of the Bush Doctrine at one level, but it was far more importantly a critique of the Democrats for failing to construct an alternative to the Bush Doctrine. And I worried at the end of that book that if they came into office without a well-worked-out alternative, it would be much easier for them for the status quo to prevail and for them to stumble into some version of that. I don't think it was only that. I think I do think the Democrats completely lack an alternative to the Bush Doctrine. They completely lack in 2019 any coherent national security strategy, and we saw this play out not only in Libya but in Syria, where Putin has a very clear strategy, and we don't really know whose side we're on. We had this idea that, Obama had this idea that Assad must go, but he didn't really have any idea what would replace him any more than he had any idea who or what would really be able to replace Gaddafi and govern in Libya. So I don't think the Democrats do have a strategy. So you can't beat something with nothing. And then I think the other thing that has fed the stumbling into these conflicts was the hubris of the early post-Cold War, that we were confusing the idea that in a unipolar world, the dominant power can do whatever it wants, which greatly conflates the capacity to destroy a country with the capacity to govern it, short of destroying it. And those two things are not remotely similar.
Thank you. So another student was wondering whether we could talk a little bit about Russia and the Middle East, which was originally listed with the topic of China and Africa on the syllabus. So,
the larger arc of the course is that the early post-Cold War period up to the financial crisis of 2008 was a period of massive overconfidence in the West and in Western institutions. One might say bordering on hubris, but I think that understates it. And we saw this in the "We Create Our Own Reality" clips, but also in the global political economy, that the Washington consensus was completely hegemonic until the financial crisis. And neoliberalism at home was hegemonic until the financial crisis. And I think that once that collapsed, other significant players reassessed geopolitics and the world economy. And that's when we started to see in China, as you lectured about, the emergence of a Beijing consensus, new attacks on the Washington consensus, greater use of state sectors in not only in their domestic economies, but also in what they were preaching abroad when they started to bring people to China to study economic management and the Confucian Institutes and so on. The Russians under Putin also reassessed the situation. They suddenly saw American hegemony starting to crack. And of course, this had begun in the geopolitics of the Middle East somewhat earlier. As I put it in the lecture, the high point of American influence in the Middle East should really be dated to the day before the invasion of Iraq, because the invasion of Iraq was a massive demonstration of American weakness. Before that, by the way, I didn't mention this in the lecture, but Israel, for example, didn't see Iraq as a threat. They saw Iran as the threat. But the Bush administration said, don't worry, we'll do Iraq first and then we'll do Iran. But if they couldn't quell a country of 25 million people, they sure weren't going to quell a country of 75 million people. And so, once the quagmire in Iraq started to unfold, the notion of the U.S. going to war with Iran became completely preposterous. So everybody saw that around the world. And when the Obama administration also bloodied itself in Libya and then Syria, Putin saw an opportunity to reassert recreated Soviet, but of course now Russian, influence in the Middle East by backing the Assad regime against an American proxy fighter that didn't have a strategy. And at the time, people from the Obama administration made fun of Putin. They said they didn't actually oppose it very hard. They thought that, people said, one person said to me off the record at the time, well, they didn't learn their lesson in Afghanistan either. After that quagmire in Afghanistan, and now they're going into Syria, and they're going to get into the same mess there. But they had a single-minded strategy, which was to support the Assad regime, and the fact that has turned out to be a successful strategy means that that they have a much more impressive imprint in the Middle East than they had before, and have reasserted themselves as a player on the geopolitical stage.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So let's shift gears a little bit towards privatization, which we had discussed earlier in the course of the semester. And a student was wondering how we should think about privatization across different regime types. So, for example, in authoritarian settings, does the principal agent problem look any different?
I don't think it looks any different as a general matter, except that the principal agent problem is always more difficult in authoritarian settings because opposition is a generator of information. We forget that the idea of His Majesty's loyal opposition was dreamed up in the 18th century to solve a principal agent problem when His Majesty didn't know whether he could trust His Majesty's ministers. Mm-hmm. And so the idea was to create an alternative set of players within the government, namely the loyal opposition, loyal to His Majesty, who would generate information if His Majesty is being ripped off or taken advantage of by the agent, in this case the ministers. The opposition would have an incentive to point that out. And so it's a proxy for market competition. It's a kind of political competition introduced within authoritarian settings to generate information. So that problem in authoritarian systems is already there. And in China, for example, they've tried to deal with it in certain kinds of ways. One is they allow village elections to be competitive in some parts of China, increasing numbers of parts of China. Again, and even people who are not in the party can run in those elections. Again, I think they see it as a way of learning about discontent, generating information. The other is that they have systematically tried to separate the issue of complaining about corruption from allowing opposition. And so you cannot oppose the Communist Party, but you can say this official is corrupt, and you can pursue that. Yeah. And that's, again, another way of compensating for the fact that they don't want political opposition, but they do recognize the disadvantages because, authoritarian systems, the trouble with getting information through the system is it's kicking up and kissing up and kicking down. You can't really trust what the people are telling you because they are the ones that might be taking advantage of you. So I don't think I don't think other than that it's any privatization would have the same principal agent problems I identified if you're running a prison system privately in an authoritarian country as in a non-authoritarian country, but it's in a setting where there are already bigger principal agent problems.
Right. Thank you. So the last couple of questions are on the housing crisis that we discussed on Thursday. And the first one is, I know that we have applied the 3 I's framework, so the interests, institutions, and ideals, to a lot of international relations topics we discussed. But is there also a way we can apply it to this idea of redlining and soft apartheid that we talked about on Thursday, both on a level of explanations, but also maybe a level of possible remedies?
So I think it's an area where ideals matter quite a lot more than in some areas of politics, and more than people might have expected. So I think two is, one is the ideal of home ownership as being part of the American dream that I talked about at some length in the lecture. What I didn't say in the lecture is in many European countries, this idea that you haven't fully arrived unless you own your own home isn't present. There are many people who have no aspirations to own their home, and there's considerably less home ownership in many European countries. So it's a very American thing. And it sort of, I think, goes back to civic Republican ideology, 40 acres and a mule. You aren't a full citizen unless you have that. And I think home ownership is the sort of modern variant of the 40 acres and a mule idea. You're not a fully independent Republican citizen if you don't have that to your name. And I think that the idea of extending home ownership to African Americans was partly a way of saying African Americans shouldn't be extended from all the full incidence of citizenship. Otherwise, it's a continuing form of discrimination, hangover from the institutional racism of the past, and that has to be eliminated. So I think that's one respect in which ideas are really important. But you asked about redlining. So the story of redlining, the larger story of redlining, is that the soft apartheid is more difficult to fight than Jim Crow or hard apartheid. That redlining is essentially, it's a cousin of the Schelling tipping game in that it's really about people's beliefs and attitudes more than it is about institutions. So, redlining is partly beliefs and attitudes and partly, in some narrow sense, interests, in that when redlining first started, it was actually supported by the government as a way of determining whether underwriting was appropriate for a certain type of mortgage. So that would be interest-based. But then the idea that there's something wrong with racially segregated neighborhoods is really about ideals, ideas, and culture. So it's a combination. Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you. Another student was asking whether we can link different ideas of fairness to different strategies for dealing with the subprime housing market.
There's definitely the sense. There's definitely the sense that it was not fair to write down people's mortgages. And here it actually links to this debate about ideals versus interests in institutions, in that even if you would tell a homeowner, don't you see that if the house next to you goes to rack and ruin, it's going to affect your property value.
Right.
They're still going to say it's not fair, it creates a moral hazard for him to write down his mortgage, to have his mortgage written down, and it's not fair that, I should stop paying my mortgage and have it written down as well. There was that perception. And so somehow unfair. We should also note in passing that, of course, bailing out the banks also creates a moral hazard, because it creates an incentive for banks to gamble, knowing they're going to be bailed out later. So it's saying this kind of moral hazard is worse than that kind of moral hazard. Or this kind of moral hazard outrages me, and that, if it outrages me for different reasons. It's not that they're getting something I'm not. It's they're being rewarded for bad management or something like that. So I think that in that respect, It's a kind of very local comparison about fairness that trumps people's literal self-interest, where it, for all the reasons John Giannakopoulos gave in that clip, it actually would have been better. It would have been better to write down the mortgages for everybody, but you can't do it politically because it collides with people's beliefs about what's fair.
Yeah. Thank you. So we also discussed the George Stigler School of Regulation, and one student was a little bit frustrated because he felt like this sounds more like identifying a problem without offering much of a solution. So does the school also actually propose something that we do about market failures and other excesses of capitalism?
Well, Stigler was a representative of Chicago School of Economics, which is sort of predecessor to neoliberalism. And I think Stigler's, he believed the moral of his story is regulation's a bad idea because regulation is always going to be captured and it's going to mess up markets. He has this argument it's going to be captured by the big players that we talked about, but they are then going to create barriers to entry. And that is the problem with regulation, is that regulation is a valuable commodity. It's using the power of government to shape markets and to control markets. And if whoever's going to get it, there's no mythical Pigouvian legislator that's going to legislate in the public interest. The legislation that gets enacted is going to benefit some private interests, and it's going to distort markets. And so I think he thought that the moral of his story is the less regulation, the better.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Thank you. So our last question is on this interesting graph that you showed at the end of the last lecture on how people by the age of 52 have had on average 12 jobs. And students were wondering...
These are baby boomers, people born
Yes.
at the end of the baby boom.
Yeah, exactly. And people were wondering how much of this can be explained by people just being laid off and having to go out and find a new job versus them self-selecting into it and trying out different jobs for professional development, career building, etc.
So I think that's a really well put question because it makes a huge difference. And I think it reinforces the challenges of the politics of insecurity that I'm going to be talking about in the next couple of lectures. Because if you think about somebody who, went to a first-rate 4-year college and then maybe spent a couple of years at McKinsey or somewhere, and then worked at 2 or 3 startups in their early 20s, then maybe went back and got an MBA, and then moved on through a variety of opportunities that were created partly by the networks that they developed when in business school, maybe internationally. For those people, by age 35, they probably have several $1 million in retirement savings. For those people, changing jobs is a series of interesting opportunities, right. and leads to a terrific cosmopolitan life, as distinct from people who are in jobs that are being, say, manufacturing jobs that are first sent offshore, and then they move into lower paying service sector jobs, which then go to technology, and so they then become maybe orderlies in a home for elderly people or something like that. So they're essentially either moving laterally or down in terms of income and status. For them, it's one calamity after another. And you're going to see a big divide in attitudes to the new economy among those two very different groups. And so one would expect them to have very different views, right? And so So one question is, well, how big is the first group relative to the second group?
Exactly.
Because they're going to have very different attitudes. And one answer to that is that the ratio is changing because the second kind of insecurity is creeping up the socioeconomic ladder. And there's an important book about this just published by Daniel Markovitz in the Yale Law School that basically shows that, all kinds of what used to be middle and upper middle class occupations are, this is sort of hollowing out of the middle class, never mind the working class. So we talked earlier today about mortgages. So 30 years ago, the banker who gave a mortgage was a person in lifetime employment who had some status in a local bank, and you had a personal relationship with that person. You knew them. They probably were, basically secure, upwardly mobile people. Who writes mortgages today? If you get a mortgage from Quicken Loans, you do the whole thing on the phone with somebody who probably has a high school education that is just typing the numbers into a software program and giving you an answer in 30 seconds as to whether you get the mortgage. And so those bankers have disappeared. Or you think about, I've been teaching at SOM for the last 7 years, Yale School of Management. 7 years ago, one of the most desirable things for a new MBA was to go into investment banking. Big data is wiping out a lot of those jobs. And so it may well be that the involuntarily employment insecure class is getting bigger and bigger, and that the people for whom this is just one wonderful opportunity after another is a steadily shrinking class.
Thank you very much. So this is it for this week. And I think we'll see each other again for one more video.
I'll look forward to it.
Thank you.